The shovel bit into the earth with a sound like a heavy sigh. Elias felt the familiar shudder travel up the hickory handle, through his palms and into the bones of his arms. It was late autumn, and the ground was hardening, resisting him. Each scoop of dark, root-laced soil was a victory measured in pounds. Beside the growing excavation, a mound of displaced earth rose like a burial mound in reverse, a testament to 3 months of solitary labor. A few feet away, lying in a patch of pale, watery sunlight, his dog Barrow watched with intelligent amber eyes. The dog, a mix of shepherd and something older and shaggier, did not bark or fidget. He simply observed, his head resting on his paws, his presence a silent, unwavering vote of confidence. When Elias paused to wipe a sleeve across his sweat-slicked brow, Barrow's tail gave a single, slow thump against the dry leaves. Elias was digging into the northern face of Thorn Hill, the gentle slope that had belonged to his family for 3 generations. He wasn't digging a root cellar or a spring house. He was digging a home. The idea was not his own. It was his father's, left behind in a leather-bound journal filled with precise diagrams, calculations of load-bearing capacities, and notes on the thermal dynamics of soil. After the fever took both his parents the previous winter, leaving Elias alone at 22, the journal was all he had left. A legacy of ink and paper, and an idea that the rest of the town of Prairie Ridge considered pure insanity. "Still at it, boy?" The voice, thick with gravel and condescension, belonged to Mr. Gable, their closest neighbor. He stood at the edge of the woods, his hands on his hips, a look of profound disbelief on his weathered face. He was a good man, in his way, a man who understood fields and fences and the solid, predictable geometry of a barn. He did not understand a man who seemed intent on burying himself. Elias drove the shovel into the ground again before answering. He did not look up. "Yes, sir." "What in God's name for?" Mr. Gable asked, stepping closer. He gestured at the hole, a rectangular pit now 12 feet deep and 40 feet long. "The Thorn homestead is a fine house. Your father built it to last. A little paint, a few new shingles is all she needs. You're digging your own grave out here." "Building a home," Elias said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the crisp air. He tossed another shovelful onto the pile. The dirt was colder now, a sign of the coming frost. Mr. Gable shook his head, a gesture of both pity and frustration. "It's a hole, son. A damp, dark hole. Wait until the spring thaw. You'll be living in a mud puddle. You think you know better than every man who's ever built a house in this valley? You think your father, bless his soul, was in his right mind when he drew up those fantasies?" Elias stopped his work and finally looked at the older man. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, clear and unreadable. He did not argue. He did not defend his father's memory or explain the principles of geothermal insulation. He simply said, "I have a plan." The finality in his tone left no room for debate. Mr. Gable sighed, the sound of a man surrendering to foolishness he could not prevent. "Don't come to me when your roof caves in from the snow. I'm telling you now, as a friend, this is a mistake." He turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the fallen leaves. Elias watched him go. He knew what they were saying in town, that grief had unhinged him, that the quiet Thorn boy had finally cracked. He felt the sting of their judgment, but it was a distant thing, like a storm on a far horizon. Closer and more real was the solid weight of the shovel in his hands, the ache in his back, and the words in his father's journal. "The earth is a blanket," his father had written in his spidery script. "It protects from the killing cold of winter and the searing heat of summer. A house should be a partner to the land, not a stranger upon it. he went back to digging. Barrow rose, stretched, and came to lick his master's hand before settling down again, closer to the work. The sun dipped lower and the air grew sharp. Elias worked until the light failed, his movements rhythmic and determined. He was not digging a grave. He was planting a seed of survival, and he would tend to it with his own sweat and blood, whether the world understood or not. This was his home. The weeks bled into one another, measured not by the calendar, but by the deepening of the hole and the growing pile of lumber and stone. He felled 20 mature pines from the backwoods of his property, limbing and bucking them where they fell before dragging them to the site with a block and tackle rigged to an old oak. His muscles hardened, his hands becoming a landscape of calluses and scars. At night, by the light of a kerosene lamp in the old homestead he would soon abandon, he'd soak his hands in hot water and salt, the sting a fierce reminder of the day's progress. He'd study his father's drawings, memorizing the joinery for the post and beam framework that would hold up the earth. One afternoon, as he was wrestling a heavy foundation stone into place, a smaller, lighter footstep approached. It was Sarah Gable, Mr. Gable's daughter. She carried a small basket. She had her mother's kind eyes, but a quiet curiosity that was all her own.
"I brought you some stew," she said, her voice soft. "Mama was worried you weren't eating properly."
Elias straightened up, wiping his dusty hands on his trousers. "Thank you." She didn't mock him or question his work. She looked at the precisely laid stones of the foundation, the massive timbers waiting their turn. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "It has to be strong," Elias replied. "The roof will hold over 4 feet of earth, plus the snow load."
4 feet?
Her eyes widened slightly. He nodded. "For insulation and strength." She looked from the hole to his face, and for the first time, he felt someone was seeing the project, not just the madness.
"My father says it will collapse."
"It won't," Elias said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of fact, as solid as the stones at his feet. She stayed for a few minutes, watching him work, asking simple questions about the wood, the stones, the plan. When she left, the stew she'd brought warmed him more than any fire could. It was the first time since his parents' death that he hadn't felt entirely alone. He ate slowly, savoring the taste, while Barrow sat at his feet, ever watchful. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. It was the kind of sunset the old-timers said was a harbinger, a warning of a hard winter to come. Elias looked at the sky, then at the shelter taking shape in the earth. He had a plan, and he was running out of time. The foundation was a painstaking affair, a jigsaw of massive field stones he hauled from the creek bed a quarter-mile away. He used a stone boat, a simple wooden sled, and Barrow often trotted alongside, as if offering moral support for the Sisyphean task. Each stone, some weighing over 300 pounds, was levered into place, fitted, and mortared. He built the foundation walls 2 feet thick, knowing they had to resist not only the vertical load of the roof, but also the immense lateral pressure of the earth behind them. Mr. Sterling, who owned the largest mercantile in town and half the valley besides, rode out on his handsome bay horse one crisp morning to inspect the curiosity. He sat astride his horse, looking down at Elias in the pit. "Thorne," he said, his voice carrying the easy authority of wealth. "Gable tells me you're trying to live like a badger. A man builds up, toward the sun. That's a sign of prosperity. What you're doing here, this is burrowing. It's primitive." Elias was setting a cornerstone, using a level to ensure it was perfectly true. He didn't stop his work. "It's practical." "Practical?" Sterling scoffed. It's a tomb. You'll get dampness, mold, lung rot. Every sensible person knows you need air circulation under a house. A proper crawl space. You're building this thing right into the water table. I'm building it above the water line, Elias said, tapping the stone with his mallet. And I've planned for drainage. He pointed with his chin toward a trench lined with gravel that sloped away from the foundation. French drain. It will carry the water away. Sterling squinted, unimpressed. Fancy names for a ditch. Son, I'll give you a fair price for this land, more than fair, considering you're digging it to pieces. You can move into town, get a respectable job at the mill. Forget this nonsense. This is my home, Elias said, his focus entirely on the stone. The offer was a dismissal of his father, of the journal, of every hour of sweat he had poured into the soil. I'm not selling. Mr. Sterling sniffed, pulling on his leather gloves. Have it your way. But when winter breaks you, don't come to me for credit. Folly is a luxury I don't finance. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving the scent of expensive leather and disdain in the air. Elias did not watch him go. He finished setting the stone, its surface perfectly flush with its neighbors. Barrow, who had been standing with a low growl in his chest, relaxed and lay back down. The dog seemed to understand the difference between concerned neighbors and arrogant dismissal. With the foundation complete, the timber framing began. This was the work of a carpenter, and Elias channeled his father's patient skill. He cut mortise and tenon joints with a handsaw and chisel, each one fitting together with the satisfying thud of precision. The 16 main support posts were of debarked pine, each over a foot in diameter. He treated the ends that would contact the stone with a thick coat of hot tar to ward off moisture and rot. Hoisting the massive ridge beam, a single timber 45 feet long and weighing nearly 1,000 pounds, was the greatest challenge. He did it alone, using a system of levers, pulleys, and a hand-cranked winch anchored to the largest oak on the hill. It took him 3 full days of agonizingly slow progress, inches at a time, his muscles screaming in protest. Barrow watched the entire process from a safe distance, whining softly whenever the great beam shifted or groaned. When it finally settled into the notches atop the main posts, Elias slid to the ground, his body trembling with exhaustion and relief. He had built the skeleton. The next phase was the most critical and the most ridiculed, the waterproofing. On top of the heavy plank ceiling, he laid down a thick membrane of overlapping sheets of tar paper, painstakingly sealing every seam with hot pitch. Over this, he shoveled a 6-inch layer of dense, wet clay he dug from the creek bank, tamping it down until it was as hard and impermeable as pottery. The town gossips had a field day with that. "He's making himself a mud roof," Mrs. Gable had reported to her husband, her voice a mixture of horror and pity. "That poor boy. The first hard rain, and it will all come washing down inside his hole." But Elias wasn't finished. Over the clay, he laid another layer of tar-sealed planking. He was creating a waterproof envelope, a shell within the earth. He worked with a singular focus, his world shrinking to the smell of tar, the feel of the wood, the pull of the muscles in his back. He often worked past dusk, the solitary glow of his lantern a small beacon of defiance against the encroaching night and the skepticism of the world. Sarah came again, this time with a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of apple butter. She watched him spreading the hot, sticky tar, his face smudged with black. "Doesn't that smell awful?" she asked, wrinkling her nose. "It smells like a dry roof," he answered, not unkindly. He paused, accepting the bread she offered. He broke off a piece for Barrow, who took it gently. "Everyone thinks you're crazy, you know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know." "I don't," she said, and the words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. She looked at the interlocking beams, the solid walls, the careful layers of the roof. I think you know exactly what you're doing." That night, Elias cut his hand badly on a sharp edge of slate he was using for the flue liner. The gash was deep, welling with dark blood. He went back to the old house, washed the wound in the basin, and stitched it closed himself with a needle and thread sterilized in the flame of his lamp. It was a crude, painful process. As he worked, Barrow rested his head on Elias's knee, letting out a soft, sympathetic whimper. Elias looked at his own trembling, bloodied hand, then at the sturdy walls of the shelter visible through the window. The pain was temporary. The shelter would last. It had to. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the windows of the old house. It had a new sound to it now, a high, mournful keen that spoke of ice and immense, empty spaces. The winter was coming. The final act of construction was the most visually strange. After backfilling the earth against the rear and side walls, Elias began to cover the roof. He used the very soil he had first excavated, rich topsoil he had carefully set aside. Assisted by a ramp and his winch, he moved tons of earth, spreading it carefully over the layered roof until it was a seamless part of the hillside. The only visible signs of a dwelling were the forward-facing wall, built of stone and timber with two small, deep-set windows and a sturdy oak door. A single stone chimney and a ventilation pipe poked up from the greening mound. To finish it, he needed to plant the roof with native grasses, their roots destined to form a dense, living thatch that would prevent erosion. It was on one of those last mild days of autumn that Sarah appeared not with food, but with a small trowel in her hand. "I thought you might need some help," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. Elias stared for a moment, surprised. Then he nodded and handed her a sack of seeds. They worked together in comfortable silence, kneeling on the roof of his house, pressing seeds into the rich soil. From their vantage point, they could see the whole of Prairie Ridge spread out below, its neat wooden houses and barns looking fragile and exposed. "It feels solid up here," Sarah said, patting the earth, "like standing on a real hill." "It is a real hill," Elias said. "The house is just inside it." Down in the valley, the signs were undeniable for those who knew how to read them. The woolly bear caterpillars wore thick black bands. The squirrels were frantic, their caches overflowing. The geese had vanished weeks ago, their honking calls a distant memory. Mr. Gable, despite his skepticism of Elias's methods, was a man of the land. He sniffed the air each morning and watched the sky with a worried frown. "Never seen a sky that color of bruised pewter for so long," he said to his wife. "And the wind, it doesn't just blow around things anymore. It feels like it's blowing through them. We're in for a bad one, Martha. A real monster." Elias felt it too. He spent his final days of preparation not on the structure, but on its sustenance. He chopped and stacked firewood until he had a mountain of it, seasoned and dry, piled inside along the southern wall. He hauled sacks of flour, beans, salted pork, and potatoes into the deep pantry he'd built into the coolest, darkest corner of the shelter. He filled barrels with fresh water from the spring. He made sure the stovepipe was clean and the flue drew perfectly. On the day the first snowflakes fell, not the gentle, meandering flakes of a normal winter, but small, hard pellets driven by a biting wind, Elias moved his few remaining possessions from the old homestead into the earth shelter. His father's journal, his mother's rocking chair, a small box of their photographs. He led Barrow inside, shut the heavy oak door, and slid the thick wooden bolt into place. The sound of the bolt was a deep, resonant thud. It was the sound of completion, the sound of safety. Outside, the wind began to howl. Inside, There was only the quiet crackle of the fire he had just lit in the cast-iron stove and the soft breathing of his dog. He had done everything his father's journal had instructed. He had endured the mockery and the doubt. He was ready. Now, all he could do was wait for the winter to do its worst. The storm did not arrive. It descended. It was a physical presence, a white darkness that swallowed the sky and erased the world. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a shrieking, relentless assault. It scoured the valley, peeling shingles from roofs and rattling window panes in their frames. Then the snow came, not falling but flying horizontally, a blinding torrent of ice and flakes that stuck to every surface and began to pile in surreal, sculpted drifts. Down in Prairie Ridge, the town hunkered down, confident in their sturdy traditional homes. But this was no traditional storm. By the second day, the wind had become a malevolent force, a battering ram that never ceased. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero and then 30. The fine, wind-driven snow was as invasive as sand, finding its way through the tiniest cracks around windows and doors, forming delicate, deadly drifts inside houses. The sound was a constant, terrifying roar that frayed the nerves and made conversation impossible. In the Gable house, the situation was growing dire. A thick layer of ice coated the inside of their windows. Despite stuffing the fireplace with wood, a bone-deep cold permeated every room. Sometime in the early morning of the third day, they heard a sound like a gunshot. A massive oak in the yard had split in the cold. A few hours later came a more terrifying sound, a deep, groaning crack from the attic. Mr. Gable fought his way upstairs, the air growing colder with every step. He pushed open the attic door and was met with a blast of snow and wind. A huge section of the northern roof had been torn away, and the wind was howling through the exposed rafters. Snow was pouring into the attic, its weight accumulating at an alarming rate. He saw the main roof beam, the one he had set himself 30 years prior, sagging ominously. He scrambled back down, his face pale. "The roof is failing, Martha," he shouted over the storm. "It's not going to hold." Mrs. Gable looked at her husband, then at Sarah, who was huddled by the weak fire, her face etched with fear. "What do we do?" Mr. Gable's eyes were frantic. He looked around the room, at the home he had built with his own hands, now groaning in its death throes. His gaze fell upon the fine layer of snow accumulating on the mantelpiece. The storm was inside with them. They were freezing to death in their own living room. And then an image flooded his mind. A sturdy oak door set into a hillside, a single stone chimney with a steady plume of smoke. The crazy boy's hole in the ground. His pride, his certainty, all of it was scoured away by the brutal, immediate fact of survival. "Get your heaviest coats," he ordered, his voice grim. "We're leaving." "Leaving? Where can we go?" his wife cried. "We'll die out there." "We'll die in here if we stay," he countered. He looked at Sarah. "We're going to Elias Thorne's place." The journey of 200 yards was a life-threatening ordeal. The moment they stepped outside, the wind tore the breath from their lungs. The snow was waist-deep, a thick, powdery trap that made every step an exhausting struggle. They couldn't see more than 3 feet in front of them. The world was a churning, white chaos. Mr. Gable tied a rope around their waists, keeping them together, and aimed for where he knew the hill should be. It was instinct and memory, not sight, that guided them. The cold was a physical pain, burning their exposed skin, stealing the heat from their bodies with shocking speed. Sarah stumbled and fell, and for a terrifying moment, her father thought he would lose her to the white vortex. He hauled her back to her feet, screaming encouragement that the wind snatched away. It was Sarah who saw it first, a faint, steady glow in the maelstrom. It was the light from one of Elias's small windows, a beacon in the impossible blizzard. They staggered toward it, half crawling by the end, their strength gone. "Mister," Gable pounded on the thick oak door with his frozen fists, his calls for help swallowed by the storm. Inside the earth shelter, the world was a different reality. The storm was a distant, muted hum, the sound of a faraway ocean. The air was warm and still, smelling of wood smoke, bread, and drying wool. The stove radiated a deep, steady heat that filled the large, single room. Barrow lay sleeping by the hearth, his flank rising and falling peacefully. Elias was at his workbench, methodically sharpening an axe, the scrape of stone on steel a quiet, domestic sound. He felt the vibration through the door more than he heard it. Barrow's head came up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elias put down the axe, walked to the door, and lifted the heavy bar. He pulled the door inward, and the storm lunged into the room, a furious blast of wind, snow, and desperate cold. 3 figures, caked in ice and snow, collapsed over his threshold. Elias quickly pushed the door shut against the blizzard's fury, the heavy bolt thudding back into place, instantly restoring the shelter's profound quiet. He helped the Gables to their feet, his face calm and unreadable. Mr. Gable was shivering violently, his beard a solid mass of ice. Mrs. Gable was weeping silently, her face raw from the cold. Sarah, her strength spent, leaned against the wall, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. The warmth, the light, the impossible, absolute peace. "The roof," Mr. Gable stammered, his teeth chattering. "Our roof, it's gone." Elias didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything. He simply helped them out of their frozen coats, sat them down on the benches near the stove, and ladled hot soup into 3 bowls. The warmth of the room, the safety of the thick earthen walls, was a more powerful statement than any words could ever be. They were safe now. They were not the last to arrive. An hour later, a more frantic pounding came at the door. It was Mr. Sterling and his wife, their fine clothes in tatters, their faces masks of terror and disbelief. The massive stone chimney on their grand house had collapsed, punching a hole through 2 floors. The wind had shattered their floor-to-ceiling parlor window, and the storm had invaded their home, destroying everything. They had made the trek guided only by the memory of where the badger hole was. They fell into the shelter, humbled and broken. Soon after, 2 more families from the lower valley arrived, the Millers and the Jensens. Their barns had collapsed, and their houses were being buried in drifts that reached the eaves. The small community of survivors grew to 17 people, huddled together in the single large room that Elias had built. The space was crowded, but it was warm and, above all, it was safe. The stone walls and the 4 feet of earth above them were impervious to the storm. The wind could not be heard, the cold could not penetrate. Elias moved with a quiet efficiency, sharing his stores of food, blankets, and water. He checked the ventilation shafts to ensure they remained clear, a task requiring a brief, brutal foray outside with a long pole. He tended to Mrs. Sterling's frostbitten fingers with a gentle competence that belied his years. He was no longer the crazy boy digging a hole. He was their anchor, their provider, the silent, steady center of their survival. On the 4th day, the wind finally began to lose its fury. The silence, when it came, was as shocking as the noise had been. Huddled in the warmth, they listened to the unfamiliar sound of nothing. Mr. Gable sat on a stool, staring into the flames of the stove. He had been quiet for hours, wrapped in a blanket and his own thoughts. He looked over at Elias, who was checking the seams on a child's torn boot. "Elias," he said, his voice raspy. Everyone in the room fell silent. "We would have died out there. My wife, my daughter, we would have frozen to death in our own home.
He swallowed hard, his pride a bitter pill.
Everything I said to you, I was a fool, a stubborn, blind fool. I'm sorry.
Elias looked up from the boot, his gaze meeting the older man's. He nodded slowly. "You're safe now," he said. It was an absolution. Mr. Sterling, a man who had never apologized in his life, cleared his throat.
He's right, son. We all misjudged you. This is the only reason we're alive.
Elias went back to his work, stitching the boot. He did not need their praise any more than he had needed their scorn. The proof was all around them. It was in the warm air, the solid walls, and the quiet breathing of the sleeping children. When the storm was truly over, on the 5th day, Elias unbolted the door. The light that streamed in was blindingly white, reflected off a transformed world. The valley was gone, buried under a sea of snow.
Drifts 20 feet high had reshaped the landscape into a smooth, alien terrain of hills and valleys. The tops of a few houses were visible, crushed and broken. Most were simply gone, marked only by a slight mound in the endless white. But the shelter was untouched. The snow had drifted up and over it, merely adding to its insulation, making it an even more integral part of the hill. The survivors emerged, blinking in the bright sun, their faces a mixture of awe and grief. They stood on the roof of Elias's home and looked out at the devastation. Their world had been destroyed, but they had endured. They looked at the shelter, then at Elias, with a new and profound respect. They had mocked him for digging into the earth, and in the end, the earth had saved them. The Great Blizzard of '88 became the defining event for Prairie Ridge, the line that divided its history into a before and an after. In the weeks that followed, as the community dug itself out and counted its losses, mostly livestock and structures, miraculously no human lives, thanks to Elias, a fundamental shift occurred. The survivors told the story of the earth shelter, of its impossible quiet and warmth in the heart of the storm. The tale spread through the valley and to neighboring towns, acquiring the weight of legend. That spring, as the massive snowpack melted and the ground thawed, the rebuilding began. But people did not rebuild as they had before. One by one, they came to Elias. First, Mr. Gable, hat in hand. "Elias," he said, "I need to rebuild my house, but I won't do it the old way. Would you be willing to show me your father's plans?" Elias retrieved the worn leather journal and laid it open on the table. He shared the knowledge freely, without condition. He helped Gable site his new home, showing him how to read the contours of the land, how to align the structure for passive solar gain, how to prepare the foundation. Sarah was often there, working alongside them, her presence a quiet affirmation of the new bond between the families. Mr. Sterling was next. He offered to pay Elias a handsome sum, but Elias refused. "This is knowledge for surviving," he said. "It's not for sale." Humbled, Sterling accepted the help, and for the first time in his life, he worked with his own hands, hauling stone and cutting timber, earning the safety of his new home. The years that followed saw the valley transformed. The hillsides, once empty, became dotted with the low profiles of earth-sheltered homes, their sod roofs greening in the summer sun. Prairie Ridge became known not for its folly, but for its resilience. People came from far away to see the houses built into the land, and Elias Thorne, the quiet man who had once been an outcast, became a respected teacher, the keeper of a vital and hard-won wisdom. He and Sarah were married the following autumn, in a simple ceremony held on the grassy roof of the home he had built. They moved his things from the old abandoned homestead, and the shelter was filled with a new warmth, the warmth of love and family. Their children were born there, and their laughter echoed in the room that had once held the frightened survivors of the great storm. Barrow grew old, his muzzle turning gray, his steps becoming slower. He spent his final years sleeping by the hearth, his amber eyes following the movements of the family he loved. One cold winter morning, he did not wake up. Elias carried his old friend's body outside and buried him beneath a young oak tree near the entrance, in a spot that caught the morning sun. He carved a simple field stone with 2 words: Barrow, a good friend. He often found Sarah or one of the children there, leaving a wildflower on the grave. The dog had been more than a pet. He had been the first believer. Decades passed. The trees grew tall, and the children grew up and built their own earth shelters in the valley. Elias's hair turned the color of snow, and his hands, though gnarled with arthritis, were never still. He taught his grandchildren how to read the sky, how to identify the strongest timbers, how to listen to the whisper of the wind. He was the patriarch of a new way of life, one born of his quiet persistence and his father's unconventional wisdom. He lived to be 87 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep, in the bed in the corner of the room he had dug from the earth, with Sarah's hand in his. The entire valley turned out for his funeral. They did not bury him in the town cemetery. They laid him to rest on the hill, next to his faithful dog, under the shade of the now mighty oak tree. His gravestone was as simple and solid as the man himself. It read, Elias Thorne. He built a home. Long after he was gone, the shelter remained. It became a landmark, a piece of living history. The oak door was replaced, the windows reglazed, but the stone walls and the massive beams held firm. The house was now a part of the hill, inseparable from the land it had been drawn from. On warm summer evenings, the children of Prairie Ridge, Elias's great-grandchildren among them, would play on its soft, grassy roof, their laughter rolling down the slope. They were safe, and they did not even have to think about it. They were sheltered by the legacy of the quiet boy who had listened to the earth, a man whose actions had spoken a single, unshakable truth, louder and more lasting than any words of doubt. It will hold.